Today military power is one of the most important aspects that makes up a G7 superpower. But here are 10 countries that, although without a military, manage to keep the peace for their people, and reap the benefits. Welcome to One Away. If you watch this video, you'll figure out that all these countries have similarities to their success except for one country. Before that, leave us a like if you find this video useful. And consider a subscription to our channel for the latest updates on our videos. Monaco, shaken not stirred. Many lands that are fairly sovereign often get labeled as a village or a town. But not Monaco, it's something else entirely. This country has been the tourist spot for any fan of 007. It has everything for a great blockbuster James Bond film, 0.78 miles with a dense 38,300 people, one of the densest cities in the world. Yearly events that involve yacht shows, a Grand Prix, and even a billionaire's playground. It has around 12,000 millionaires who live a square mile off each other. The average home alone costs around $4,500 per square foot. And it's a sovereign city-state between France and Italy and named after Hollywood royalty. But, for all its high-profile wealth, this principality has been comfortable to not have a military army since the 17th century. It's only ever had security for two things: for the royal family, and for the people. The police number by the hundreds though, and they occupy much of the squares in the city. Those millionaires, after all, need all that protection from threats. Other than that, the country gets most of its protection from France. The country seems jam-packed with commerce and trade to give care. The trade that seems to profit Monaco are rent houses and casinos, most of which are only accessible to foreigners. It is not a surprise to know that much of the citizens in Monaco are foreign-born. Apart from lack of military, Monaco has almost the opposite approach from others on this list, but it's arguably the wealthiest in GDP per capita and the highest average person's life expectancy at 85 years. Monaco has the house, and it's got all the cards too. The old country of Andorra. The land of Andorra, which has been around for 1,000 years, is in fact not a region, not a city, but a country. Albeit, the scale of this country might not fit the typical description. For one thing, it doesn't have a military. After all, it's the 16th smallest country in the world, and it ranks 11th in terms of population with a total of 85,000, and with only a 40 kilometers drive from one side of the country to another. It has, of course, its local police and even some special units for counter-terrorism, but doesn't have much military might. It puts most of its emphasis on its protection from its two neighbors, Spain and France. Due to these, Andorra is probably one of the only co-principality under two countries, which is a special case in itself. One case of interest is that though France and Spain are its main defense, Andorra has only made official the Catalan language of Spain, even though France once occupied it. Andorra relies on these countries not only militarily, but also economically, as both France and Spain are accepted in Andorra with the euro as official, and with its local dinar only a case for collections. Due to allied security and trade, Andorra is famous for its tobacco production, and other luxury goods, all at an affordable price. Even though it doesn't have an airport, it remains a country with the most tourists, at 100,000 visitors per year. That and the Andorra La Vella, the highest capital city in all of Europe, with 1,023 meters to its reputation, and with a cool statue to boot. With all that in a place, it's probably not a surprise that its people enjoyed no war for 1,000 years, and a life expectancy of 82.9 years on average, which is the 8th highest in the world. Andorra is quite old world Europe, but with a bit more to shop for as well. Plan de vida in Costa Rica. If there's been a place that tourists and vacationers are all too familiar with, it's Costa Rica. And it's probably no surprise, since Costa Rica has been one of the happiest countries in the world. Although it's arguable, Costa Rica has had no military since the year 1948, after the horrible experience of a civil war and a world war. And we can only speculate that the lack of a strong military has kept many Costa Ricans contented and happy. Costa Rica, after all, boasts one of the blue zones in the world, Nicoya. According to researcher Dan Buettner, many of the Nicoya inhabitants live over the age of 100. Much of this attributed to a plan de vida, or a plan for life, which for many Nicoyans include prayer, a family, and nature. The country uses renewable energy solutions, and there's a lack of stress associated with no military power too. Costa Rica is a jewel in Central America, and has many lessons to teach a great many places. Iceland. Iceland, home to many sites, which also includes set locations for the popular series adaptation, Game of Thrones. With its unique horse breeds, glacier environment and northern lights that are seen from September to March, Iceland has become a poster boy for the infamous phrase, "Winter is coming." But believe it or not, unlike the brutal context of that Game of Thrones line, this part of Scandinavian abolished its military system back in 1869. In fact, it's been the only country under the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, that hasn't had a military ever since. It has relied instead on the defense security operations of its neighbor NATO states for great protection. But it doesn't mean that Iceland is without any protection for its people. So far, it has had services for security for several communities, namely an air defense, well-armed police, coast guards, peacekeeping forces. This is important since about 60% of the population is packed in the great capital of Reykjavik. And most in the capital has an assortment of restaurants, bars, museums and cafes, and places to help citizens publish their write-ups, which is a tradition in Iceland. With a combination of vast nature, a proactive capital, and only local and travel security, Iceland bagged the Nordic Nature and Environment Prize back in 2014. The capital city even has a goal to get the carbon-neutral status by 2040. Iceland was in fact the last place for human settlement, and the locals seem to want to keep that outlook. Dominica, not Dominican. This country in the Caribbean has been featured in films like Pirates of the Caribbean, and has often been confused with the Dominican Republic. But Dominica is over 600 miles away from that respective republic. Another difference is that this country has abolished its army back in 1981. In fact, most of its security and defense is catered only by certain groups like the Commonwealth of Dominica Police Force and Coast Guards and a Special Services Unit. It's also been important to the country to not have a strong military since there are indigenous people who live off the land. Much of this has been a recognition from its people, who are often a mix of enslaved Africans and island Caribs. The first of these island Caribs, the Kalinago, survive on their territory to this day, with 3,000 on the island. Most live in the villages. Much of these natives make handicrafts for sale and also help disseminate information about herbal medicines locals use today, such as the moringa plant. And many visitors enjoy the island nation for its volcanoes, rivers, mountain chicken and its whales. The establishment of the military can tempt leaders to impose restrictions on an otherwise happy people. Liechtenstein. There's probably not many countries that embody that mix of Austrian and Switzerland than Liechtenstein. Author Alain de Botton has often talked about Switzerland's many achievements. No poverty, great education, and a peace that been kept in check since the Treaty of Bavaria. And yet, the country of Liechtenstein is all that and more. Unlike probably the others, Liechtenstein abolished its army back in 1868. The reason? High cost in maintenance. Truer words probably have never been spoken. It only has given the focus on the Liechtenstein National Police, sometimes with its neighbors, and an army mandate, if it ever arose. Thankfully, it never arose. Since then, the people here have enjoyed great peace and community. The most number of people in the city only has 6,000 people. It's the only country with a 100% territory in the Alpine region, which gives access to all that fresh air. It doesn't have an airport, and many have the second least visited rank in all of Europe. But it has the second highest GDP in the world, despite all that, with no debt. The country knows it has enough, and most people commute to their daily activities. Might we all benefit to learn from Liechtenstein? The Solomon Islands. Not exactly the Bible version, but the natural environment that the islands have for its many people, visitors, and tourists. Which is not a surprise that the island's Royal Solomon Police Force never really made it to a full-blown paramilitary, after much internal conflict. For those conflicts, both Australia and New Zealand had to intervene, as well as some other countries from the Pacific. To this day, the Solomon Islands have had a police force via the Maritime Surveillance Unit, and that's about it. For one thing, it would take more than a police force to circumnavigate and militarize the various 1,000 islands together, all of them scattered. From the Shortland Islands to the places of Anuta and Tikopia, that are already 1,800 kilometers. Plus, those scattered islands also have around an estimate of 550,000 people, most of which have developed their own customs and traditions, with regards to the lands. And of course to this day, the Solomon Islands remain a pristine paradise. All that military control could very well put an end to that. It's a relatively good thing the early plans were halted. Santa Lucia. The island of Santa Lucia, or Saint Lucia, is probably the only island nation that is named after a woman. That is special in and of itself, but it also has a special place in the history of its inhabitants. It's important to note that St. Lucia's mode of defense is only provided by the regional security system, like those of its neighbors. For example, much of its police force does indeed have a paramilitary special service unit, but only ever looks after internal security. That is when times get really difficult. But, it's never been a full-on military army. To a great part, it never needed to have one. After all, it's already had its fair share of colonialism and territory issues with the Dutch, British, and French. And it's only the scale of one of Scotland's isles. It basically doesn't have many motives for a great-scale military, from all its history and geography. Plus, tourists know it for more than that. The temperature is pleasant all year round. It's got a dive-in volcano. Not to mention, it's got a Nobel Prize winner in Derek Walcott. United, the Pacifics. The Pacific Ocean is home to many people and communities, often called seafarers. It's one of the reasons actor Jason Momoa loved his promotion for the first Aquaman film. It gave him a platform to promote people of the Pacific Islands, all networked by the seas. Aside from similar customs and traditions, these islands also have something else in common: most of them don't have a military army. You could argue that they did, back in their stories and myths. But as of current, many of them have promoted peace by their provision of aids, in the case that conflict happens to arise. And though that's one of their commonalities, some of them arrived at it differently. For example, in most of Micronesia, the island nations don't have a military and have been under the defense and security of the United States. There's also the land of Kiribati, that because it's located in the central Pacific Ocean, military armies are basically a non-entity. Instead, New Zealand and Australia give aid to their internal conflicts. And it's the same with the land of Nauru, who has to work with Australia for much of its defense. In the land of Samoa, they've built those defense ties with the people of New Zealand. Most of them though have local police, such as the police force of the Tuvalu Island. Many advanced areas can argue that the lack of military security is a weakness, but to these communities, it's a matter of partnerships and agreements. Il Vaticano. Almost everyone has heard about the Vatican and of Vatican City. Home to many things, you've probably seen it in from news about the papacy and the Pope, films like Angels and Demons with Tom Hanks, religion history lessons about Christianity. So it stands to high reason that Il Vaticano wouldn't have a military army, and it doesn't. It is though, a very powerful sovereign state, with a long storied history of the Noble Guards and the Palatine Guards who were abolished in 1970. Despite its population and scale, it remains powerful, and arguably the sole owner of the only heritage city under UNESCO. And rightfully so, it's probably the only place with ATMs in the Latin language, and host of the most wine drunk in any part of the world. Safe to say, it takes the message of Christendom quite literally. The only real security that surrounds the Vatican is a power beyond, the Swiss Guard for the Santo Papa, and the Gendarmerie Corps for internal conflicts. And of course, the many devoted. Do you think we are better off without a strong military? The superpowers seem to disagree, and you might want to check out their reasons in our video, Top 5 Future Superpowers in the World. And if you're a fan of the old traditions in many countries, take a look at our video on oldest companies in the world.